Good afternoon, and once again, I want to welcome you to today's Maniac Talk. It is an honor for me to introduce our speaker, Dr. Antonio Busalacchi, President of the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research, simply known as UCAR, and he has been there since August 2016. After receiving a PhD in Oceanography back in 1982, Antonio Otone came to this place and successfully built block by block, a very distinguished career in the geosciences. He has extensive experience in management of academic, laboratory, and government programs, and he has broad knowledge of the community. Obviously, we know this because he has served on the National Academy of Sciences on many committees, chaired many of them as well. So he's well known out there. But today, he is going to talk about his own journey and share some of the wisdom gathered over the years, especially with the colleagues who are just starting out. How did he get there? Or what step did he take to get there? How did he get involved in what he's doing now? And what excites him about it today? Ladies and gentlemen, help me welcome our speaker, Antonio Busalacchi.
So good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much. I had a lot of fun putting this talk together. This is my life sort of talk, and it really helped to illustrate for me how much my 18 years here influenced the following 17 years, and hopefully counting. So the talk is with apologies to Burt Lancaster. And the story begins here. This is my father's family. My grandparents immigrated from Sicily in the early 1900s and moved to Milwaukee. And this is my father. And we think this was confirmation because he's got the flower on his lapel. My father lived to be 100, passed away 3 years ago. He outlived everyone here except his little brother in the sailor suit. My father grew up speaking the Sicilian dialect and didn't learn English till he went to grade school. None of anyone up here went to college. They all graduated from high school. When my father was 30, he served in Europe during World War II, and then when he came back, used aspects of the GI Bill and opened up a restaurant in Milwaukee, an Italian restaurant, of course, not far from where they grew up. So he married my mother in the 1950s, and in the early 1960s, one of my uncles on the previous page moved to South Florida, and so during spring break, we would go to drive from Milwaukee to South Florida, and one of the trips was in New Orleans. So this picture was taken in Pat O'Brien's in New Orleans. You can see the hurricane glass there. There's another part to the New Orleans story, is that when my grandparents immigrated from Sicily, they went to Milwaukee, and then they actually moved to New Orleans. They opened up a grocery store in New Orleans, and my grandmother loved it much more in New Orleans because the weather was much more like Sicily. In Milwaukee, when she hung the clothes out to dry in March, she took them off the line and stood them up in the corner. But there were more jobs in factories and foundries for my grandfather. Ended up moving back to Milwaukee, and then about 6 years ago, my wife and I bought a place in the French Quarter, and we actually spend a good part of our time down in New Orleans these days. So to begin this journey, the early years, all right, I found this in the family archives. Born July 20th, and I was baptized at Our Lady of Pompeii Church, which was the Italian church in that neighborhood. And much like other cities around the country, when the freeways came in into major metropolitan areas, it destroyed, a lot of that sort of ethnic infrastructure. There I am in short pants. I had a younger brother, Michael. We lived in Milwaukee till I was about 5 years old, and then we moved to the suburbs in the city of Brookfield. And entered kindergarten there. And Brookfield was a very progressive school district for that time and for the state of Wisconsin. And so here is my first promotion, graduating from kindergarten into the first grade in 1962, the first of many promotions. Fast forward 13 years, July 20th, 1969, my birthday, was the lunar landing. And I was a product of the space race. As a kid, I mailed away to NASA and got all the literature about the Mercury program and the Gemini program, and who would have known I was going to end up here. The other point, though, was earlier that summer, my family took another road trip. We drove all the way down from Milwaukee to Mexico City and Acapulco. And while in Mexico, of the four of us in the family, I ate something that was contaminated and came down with hepatitis. So just like the astronauts, when they came back, I watched the moon landing in quarantine in a hospital for 2 weeks. So that was interesting. And when we were in Acapulco, I did scuba diving for the first time. I had an uncle, actually the uncle in the sailor suit, ended up being a scuba diver. And so I was interested in that. And since junior year of high school, I knew I wanted to be an oceanographer. Even though scuba diving had nothing to do with what I was end up doing as an oceanographer. But even as a kid, I realized there were parts of our oceans that we knew less about than outer space. And so I kind of started becoming certified when I was 15 and became certified when I was 16. And then about, I guess, a year after this point, between my junior and senior year of high school, my father's restaurant had a terrible fire, and it basically was destroyed. And in some of those previous trips to Florida, my father had purchased several lots in South Florida. And so in 1973, we moved from Brookfield to Stuart, Florida. And Stuart is about 40 miles north of West Palm Beach. My father retired at that time at 58, so I guess I didn't learn from my father. I should have retired 3 years ago, I guess it was. Moving to Florida between my junior and senior year of high school was a bit awkward, but it's actually quite good for my brother because my brother was entering high school at the time, so the timing was perfect for him. So based on the hairstyles and my mother's comment and the dress of the era, you can see it's the 1970s. I graduated from high school in 74, and given the high school curriculum in Brookfield in Wisconsin, when I moved to Florida, Stuart was basically a retirement town of 5,000 people. There was one high school in Martin County, and it was Martin County High School. And the high school in Florida actually gave me a lot of credit for the courses I had as a junior in Wisconsin, qualified for senior level credit at the high school in Florida. So when I was there for my lone year of senior high school, to fill up my curriculum, I took a lot of junior college classes. And so took a lot of math courses with several colleagues here in the picture at a local junior college. And the other good thing about Stuart at the time, because it's this retirement community, there was a heck of a lot of scholarship money. And so here's some 12 of us getting some money from a foundation, received a scholarship from Grumman Aerospace, and actually was able to come back during summers and holidays and work for Grumman. Doing some, Grumman used at the plant in Florida, is, Vietnam War days, planes that were shot up. They would retrofit the planes and service them and make them flyable again. So I kind of got my first exposure to, the real world, what it's like in the business world, by working summers and holidays at Grumman. So that was an interesting experience. All right, the formative days, post-high school. So here is my ID from Florida State, all right. When I was up in Wisconsin, I had started to meet with a bunch of admission officers for universities because I knew I wanted to get into oceanography. And then we ended up in Florida. And Florida State, first of all, was a state school. And it was one of the few in the nation that offered some exposure to oceanography as an undergraduate. So I ended up getting my bachelor's in physics, but with an interdiscipline in oceanography. And given the junior college credits I had in Stewart while in high school, I entered, and with advanced placement, I entered Florida State as a sophomore. So I got my bachelor's in 3 years. Again, chose physics because if I didn't like oceanography, I'd have something to fall back on. And so graduated in 77. First in my family that graduated from college. And from there, apart from my father, these are three of the gentlemen that were served as my mentors. The top two, some of you know. The one on the bottom you don't know. So Jim OBrien, my major professor, Mark Kane at Lamont, and I'll describe their influences on me. And Go Bronson is the person that got me into the wine business. And so when I gave my wine talk here 2 months ago, large credit goes to Dan, but also he was a very successful businessman who lives in Santa Rosa, California, and we used to exchange war stories on leadership and management, et cetera. And so another great individual. So while I was in Milwaukee, I started taking up judo. Was a state championship. I captained the judo team at Florida State. I competed at the national level and would practice with Olympians and finished as high as 4th in the national championships one year. And kind of mention it because I'm the sort of person that believes that you make your own luck, that being at the right place and the right time is not really circumstance, but it's more a result of how you've positioned yourself. And it's not just serendipity. So while I was a college senior, I started going around and interviewing the oceanography professors at Florida State. And this would have been in the spring of '77. I was flying back from the National Judo Championships and was waiting to connect on the flight from Atlanta to Tallahassee, and lo and behold, I'm sitting next to Jim OBrien. And so on the flight to Tallahassee, he was recruiting me and I was recruiting him, and never regret it. As students, we always thought Dr. OBrien walked on water, and maybe that was true in that regard. But Jim was a great mentor. Maybe not the best classroom teacher, but in terms of writing a paper, critical thinking, developing a proposal, preparing to give a seminar, Jim really gave students those opportunities at the earliest possible point in their career. And it was the sort of things where I didn't see my peers benefiting to that extent from their major professor. And so when I went to Maryland for 15-some years, I taught a graduate level course on Earth System Science. There's some in the audience I see that benefited. And a large part of what it means to be practicing scientist came from my experience with Jim, and I tried to bring it into the classroom. Jim had a real fatherly approach to his students and supported them long after they left the nest, as it was. So here I am at my office. No one dared mess with my desk, all right? At about this time, I got married in 1977. I didn't realize it at the time until I started preparing this talk that this was a government issue steel case desk, the same desk I had when I came to Goddard. So again, another aspect of putting these talks together. It's ironic now that I'm in Boulder in that I did the computing for both my master's and PhD thesis on the Cray 1 at InCar. And this is from one of my first public talks. This is the AGU talk when it was still, AGU was at the Jack Tar Hotel in December 1979. And again, OBrien liked to give his students the opportunity to present their work as early as possible. So I'd only been a graduate student a couple of years. This was a reduced gravity ocean model. You can see the memory of the machines at that time did not allow us to have a symmetric grid. So this particular model description went from 18 north to 12 south. It was a model that was it was a response, looking at the response of the tropical ocean to zonal winds with the first and annual semi-harmonic of the forcing for the tropical Pacific. And that's what my master's thesis was about. And shown here in black is the simulated picnic line height anomaly, which is a proxy for sea level in the thermocline in the eastern equatorial Pacific versus the observations at the time. And so I defended my thesis in 1980, my master's thesis. I came back into the room after the committee deliberated, and as part of my defense, they told me they actually wanted to give me a PhD degree for my master's. And I said, I was only 23 at the time, and I clearly realized I needed more seasoning. I needed more experience in writing. So I graciously declined. The big O, as we call Jim OBrien behind his back, he encouraged me to go on to MIT for my PhD because I had been in Tallahassee for my bachelor's and master's. But I realized I could not have gotten guidance from a better mentor than Jim. So I chose to stay in Tallahassee for the rest of my graduate career, and clearly was the right choice for me. This is now from a talk I gave at the spring AGU in 1981, and now we're using realistic wind forcing. At this time, Jim OBrien hired a bunch of undergraduates to do subjective analyses of whatever sparse wind observations there were in the tropical Pacific, and gridded and digitized those data to have monthly mean winds over the tropical Pacific Ocean from about 30 north to 30 south. And then I used these more realistic wind to study the interannual variability of the tropical Pacific. So here's the simulated picnic line height anomaly at the Galapagos Ocean. Now this is for 10 years at this talk at AGU in 1981. And then for my PhD thesis, extended it for another 18 years, modeled versus observed changes in depth of the thermocline in eastern equatorial Pacific. This is a lead-lag correlation matrix along the equator from west to east, showing the influence of eastward progressing Kelvin waves in the ocean, westward propagating Rossby waves related to the sea level variability at the equatorial eastern boundary. And the conclusions of that talk in 81 were basically showing the importance of remote forcing via equatorial wave dynamics, and then portending what this means for El Nino forecasting. That this was some of the groundwork that demonstrated with realistic, this is one of the first studies that used real winds, and that demonstrated the importance of these teleconnections in the ocean and what that would portend in a coupled atmosphere-ocean context. And so my thesis ended up being looking at the wind-driven variability, the seasonal variability in the Atlantic Ocean, and the interannual variability in the Pacific Ocean. Also, I have never been a person to set career goals. I think I'm the sort of person that what would happen if I set a goal and then achieve it? And so I've never been the sort of person to set career goals, other than I thought when I came to Goddard, I'd kind of be on like a 5-year plan. I'd be here for 5 years and go on. Well, 5 years, ended up being 18. So during my last year at FSU, Mark Kane and I had written a proposal to fund my postdoc. I was going to go up to MIT and be Mark's postdoc in Boston. And in early 1982, while I was in Tallahassee, I was offered an NRC postdoc here. And I told the powers that be I had already committed to being a postdoc with Mark, and it wasn't a negotiating tactic. I mean, we had already done it, and it was even starting to look at housing in Boston. And then Goddard came back to me with a civil servant position. I said, well, now this is a game changer. So I thought a lot about it hard. I felt bad about going back on the agreement with Mark, so Mark and I discussed it a lot. And Mark was very supportive of me starting my civil servant career here at age 26. So I started my professional career here in 1982. So now we transition to the Maryland years. And so in August of 1982, I signed on as a GS9 Step 1, making $19,477. And the problem was that I was not going to graduate until I'd finished all the research on my PhD thesis. I don't think I had defended at the time, but the next formal commencement was in December of '82. But there was a fear during the summer of 1982 that there would be a hiring freeze. Sound familiar? Okay. And so I was hired on with a master's degree as a GS9. And immediately turned around and put on leave without pay to go back to Tallahassee to finish my degree and come back. And sure enough, a month later, Roger Jenkins, so another voice from the past, in September 7th of 1982, issued this memo regarding the potential of furloughs in 1982. So in the end, things did get resolved, and I came back and started here as a GS-12 in December of 1982. Came here and moved into our garden apartment at Spring Hill Lakes, and about a week later, a huge snowstorm, for those that remember, in December of '82. This is also the time when both Georgetown and Virginia were at their heydays in basketball. Ralph Sampson at Virginia and Patrick Ewing at Georgetown, and they were playing at what was the Capitol Center there. So I went out and got scalpers tickets and saw Ralph Ewing and Patrick Ewing and Ralph Simpson play basketball, like 10 days after I arrived. So this is from November of '83, my first art-top. So this, I didn't print the back line, but this is from Stan Wilson to Les Meredith. Stan was the head of the Oceans Division at NASA headquarters. And so here is my first funding. I felt so fortunate to have $56K in for FY '84. And the guidance they gave me and what headquarters wanted me to be doing. And a number of people will see their names here. This was the list of the funding from Stan Wilson. So Bill Craybill, Paul Shop, Eugenia, Claire, there you are, $85K. Joey and Jay and Don, Norden Wong, Shukla, etc. And something, so I actually had known Stan Wilson before, because prior to Stan Wilson coming to NASA headquarters, he was at ONR. And ONR had a history of site visits, going around to universities around the country where their grantees would have to defend their work. And so for me, we're civil servants, so our salary is funded by the government, and we write a 2-page RTOP, right, to get money. That's a pretty sweet deal. And yet, I won't name names, but some are on this list. I don't think any in the audience, that were complaining about having to get up once a year and give a 20-minute talk to defend. I said, come on, it's not the real world. Yeah, indeed. All for the want of a 2-page RTOP. So back to Mark. Even though I ended up coming here, Mark and I worked for several years. And so I took a bunch of trips to Boston, and then when Mark went up to Lamont, Mark essentially served as my postgraduate mentor. And so even though I didn't have a formal postdoc, I was able to start my own sort of independent career in advance of a postdoc. This worked out great. I continue to be colleagues and friends to this day. And years later, when the International Research Institute for Climate Prediction started, Mark tried to recruit me to Lamont to be the director of the IRI. And I distinctly remember having a Chinese dinner with Mark off of Broadway where the two of us downed a bottle of Remy Martin cognac. So I don't know if it was just the hangover the next morning that guided me not to take the position at the IRI, but clearly remember that dinner. My son, Tony III, was born in 1988, and we lived in Laurel at the time. So here he is in Little League. And in 1988, I became head of the Oceans and Ice branch, and that really started to broaden my interdisciplinary career. As a student, I already had, that sort of a background. My degree was in oceanography. Jim O'Brien, his tenure home was in meteorology, and I studied air-sea interaction. But as a branch head, I got exposed to ocean biology, the cryospheric processes, and colleagues like Claire. I also had the opportunity for leadership training, and so this is a picture of the GLES class, 21st GLES class in October 1960. So let's see, there's Chet, Vicki Pendergast, Cindy Hall, and there's other faces there you can recognize. And so again, I didn't appreciate at the time, what these sorts of leadership training would mean for me. And this is something I think we're lacking at InCar. We don't have training for our frontline managers. Well, we haven't in the past. We are now in the future. And at a university, it's kind of mixed. Some universities, you do have exposure to this kind of training, but more often than not. Then in 1990, I became head of the Laboratory for Hydrospheric Processes. And again, being lab chief, I didn't fully appreciate what that meant for my career down the line. So this is the lab brochure we prepared, and it really sort of, these little thumbnail sketches show the breadth across the lab. I was a source selection official for the contractor Orbital Sciences for the CWIFS mission, the aircraft, both passive and active radar microwave measurements of soil moisture, precipitation, cloud formation, heck of a lot in common with what we do at InCar these days. High performance computing, global modeling activities. And I had the opportunity to work with a great number of branch heads. So this is the preface from the brochure. Bob Kirk, Chet Koblinski, Dave Clem, Ted Engman, Les Thompson, Claire, there you are. Peggy's named. But especially on the instrumentation side, so hydrology, the aircraft, the microwave activities, really was something that I, prior to that point in time, was not part of my background. I also thought it was important to continue my own scientific career while being a branch head and a lab chief. But I was always very conscious not to do my own personal science through the lab, and even when I was at ESIC. I never relied on the resources of the lab, especially in the days when travel money, well, in the days, travel money is still tight. But I went out to NOAA and got travel money for my own personal science and continued to work on ocean modeling, coupled atmosphere ocean modeling, coupled biological physical modeling, applications of remote sensing. And so this is a paper we did with my closest professional colleague, Joël Picot, who will come up in a couple slides later. One of the first sort of depictions of the whole life cycle of an ENSO event from start to finish from space-based platforms. Sea surface temperature, sea level, surface winds, and surface currents. And then independent from modeling, just analysis and diagnostics of the perspective of, for the most part, the tropical oceans that we got from platforms like Topex and Poseidon. More leadership training with the SCS school in Hagerstown in 1992. And there you can see Franco in the back page, incognito with his beard, all right, at the time. And it was also about this time in 1993 when I became involved in the Tropical Ocean Global Atmosphere program. This is my first academy program. This is my first activity within the World Climate Research Program. And I think this may have been in Japan, but about 1993. I also ascribe to the adage of working hard and playing hard. And here is a group of equatorial theoreticians and modelers that we came up through science and our careers together. So Lou Rothstein, Mike McFadden, Jay McCreary, and Joël Picot. As a group, we were known as the Animals. I will not go into why we were called the Animals, all right? But several times when we had multi-week meetings, we would pool our per diem, and rather than staying in a hotel, we rent a house. So this is a chateau outside Toulouse that I rented. And it ended up being cheaper for the government, all right? And it was a pretty nice place. Twice we rented houses on the north shore of Hawaii, one on the beach. Before the days of internet, we'd pack up our plots and a portable printer and go somewhere, a nice place, but somewhere desolate, to write a paper. So Mike, Joel, and I wrote a paper in Bali, Indonesia once. We rented a cottage in Orcas Island in Puget Sound and knocked off another paper. So as a group, we've come up through our careers together. So here I am with my favorite NASA administrator receiving an SES award. Next. About this time, I was recognized as Alumnus of the Year at Florida State, so that was nice. It was my first and only time I ever appeared in a homecoming parade. So I perfected my wave. So here are the Animals playing hard. This was the end of the TOGA program. And TOGA was a 10-year program, 85 to 95. And about halfway through the program, Mike had the brilliant idea. There was a bunch of TOGA meetings, and a number of TOGA meetings. And so Mike came up with the idea that we should solicit $1 from every participant at a TOGA meeting for each day of the TOGA panel meeting. And so over the years, we built up a pretty good kitty. And at the end, in 1995, we basically threw a party in the old Melbourne jail, Melbourne, Australia. And so you can see, everyone was in costume. Post-TOGA, as the towel array of buoys was well underway in the Pacific Ocean. Several of us, actually Mike's not in this picture, but Mike McFadden, myself, Divino Mura, Jacques Servin, started up an array of buoys in the Atlantic Ocean, joint between the US, France, and Brazil, called Pirata. And here I am on the left at one of the Pirata meetings in Fortaleza, Brazil, at the Pirata Bar. So a lot of effort went into naming the pilot research array in the tropical Atlantic to come up with the name of the program, Pirata. And Sergio is well familiar with this program. You can also see that the apple does not fall far from the tree. So here's my son. I think you can see the similarity. In 1990, I remarried, and here we are in South Florida. I don't think my wife looks very happy. I don't know. That's the only good photo I could find. My brother has grown since the first photo. Joël Picot was my closest professional colleague. And so I was the best man at his wedding, in a typical French wedding. There's the mayor of the town, all right? And it was a quite nice celebration. PostToga, I became involved in the CLIVAR program and served as co-chair of CLIVAR from 2000 to 2006. And so Chet is here, also now a number of my InCar colleagues. There's Jim Hurl and Kevin Trenberth, and I'm sure you can recognize other colleagues in that photo. And then from there, I chaired the Joint Scientific Committee of the World Climate Research Program from 2008 to 2014. I'm also the sort of person, I go by my gut. I do rely on that sort of instinct. So I was actually interested to read this article in Scientific American about one's gut being the second brain. So it's an interesting sort of read. So I found that interesting to come across. So I mentioned the mentors in my life. These are the bosses in my life that I've really benefited from. All three individuals I greatly respect. So on the left, Dave Atlas was the person that hired me. And I would argue that Dave was responsible for, putting this Earth Science organization on the map. And a lot of the talent that was hired in the late 70s and early 1980s is a credit to Dave, really bringing in excellent talent. Vince Solomonson was a true gentleman in all connotations of the word. And I really enjoyed serving under Dave. And Steve Halpern was the dean of the College of Computer Math and Physical Science at that time, who recruited me to Maryland. He was a great boss. When he stepped down as dean, he actually joined us at ESIC. And in fact, I had dinner with Steve last night. So all three of these individuals had a major influence on me. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Franco. We had a great run together as lab chiefs for about a period of 10 years when Franco, Dave Smith, and I, and Jim Hansen in New York were the 4 science lab chiefs. And so it was a fun era. Franco, Dave Smith, and I would have monthly breakfasts together in the cafeteria. And Vince was always suspicious that we were plotting against him. And maybe Vince was a little bit right, all right? And in addition to that gang of 3, we always look forward to our annual trip in December to GIS that Milt would lead. When we always see a Broadway show, and we'd have senior staff meetings up in New York at GIS. So here my wife and I are at the rec center for my going away party with Al Diaz, sharing our mutual passion for a bottle of wine. And as another example of things coming back full circle, Al's just been nominated to serve on the board of trustees for UCAR. And so if elected, I'll be closing that loop. And so when I gave my wine talk here a couple months ago, it was good to see Al come here and see him again. Over the years, I've benefited from a great group of colleagues and students and postdocs. So here are the 4 of the 5 animals. And in the center is Raghu Murdagudi. Raghu was a student of Mark Kane. He was a postdoc here with me here, and now is on the faculty at the University of Maryland. And in addition, in the audience today are Eric Hackert, who was my student. I don't know if Stephanie is here, Stephanie Ooze, and I see other faces of students from Maryland that took my course. So again, I clearly benefited from the association. And it's probably one of the things I miss the most from having left Maryland. So in 2000, I moved over to Maryland to head up ESIC. ESIC was Franco's initiative, started based on a cooperative agreement between the Laboratory for Atmospheres and what was then the Department of Meteorology. And then not too long after that, Dave Smith's lab and my lab joined on. In the late 1970s, there was an unsuccessful search for an ESIC director, and I was on the search committee on this end. And about that time, I was being recruited by Florida State with an endowed chair to take over Jim O'Brien's old organization. And that was about a 9-month courtship, and in the end, I told Florida State no. And then when Maryland found out that I was movable, in a matter of months, I found myself at Maryland heading up ESIC. From about 2000 to 2006, we were on the main campus, and then we moved to the Research Park M Square, where ESIC was the anchor tenant in this building. And about 2 years later, NOAA moved in across the street, NOAA's National Weather and Climate Prediction Center. And I won that bet with Louis Uccellini. I bet Louis that we'd been in our building before he's dead, and his builder went bankrupt. So I'll tell a Louis story. So Nancy heard the story yesterday. I gave a talk at the Maryland Space Business Roundtable, and so I was sitting next to Louis. And Louis says, tell the story. So the host was having difficulty pronouncing mine and Louis' last name. So in May, Louis Uccellini, Tony Busalacchi, Mary Glacken, and a FEMA director from Florida were testifying to Senator Shelby, Senate Commerce Committee. And the good Senator Shelby was having a little bit of difficulty pronouncing Louis Uccellini and Antonio Busalacchi. So by the end of the hearing, he was referring to the 2 of us together as Buscalini. But in all seriousness, Senator Shelby is a staunch supporter of what we, UCAR, and what NOAA are doing at the National Water Center in Alabama. And that was the primary focus of what I talked about yesterday. So I talked about my mentors. I talked about my bosses. I'll also be remiss if I didn't speak to any leader of any sort is only as good as the people that they work with. And again, I really benefited from a number of colleagues. Rosa, I could not find your picture. I looked for it. So I've always tried to pick or choose deputies that complement my background. So as lab chief, I really benefited from Bill Barnes' expertise at ESIC, from Phil Arkin. I just saw Phil yesterday or 2 days ago. On the IT side, Rosa and Mark Baith was here and then came to ESIC. And then administrative support, Claire McCauley, Michelle when she was Michelle Gover. And at ESIC, Linda Carter truly is Wonder Woman. And assistant deputies. So I couldn't find a picture of Jim Ormsby, and so that's why Jim and Andy doesn't have a picture here, because I couldn't find one. But it was Bill Barnes, Jim Ormsby, and myself. And at ESIC, it's been Phil, and Andy came across as well. And again, I've been the beneficiary of those colleagues. I gave this talk here 2 months ago, but Dan Go Bronson was the one who got me into this endeavor. In that about 15 years ago, I joined a food and wine society that's a combination of professionals and lay people. And I got kind of entrained on the wine side and started administering wine dinners in Baltimore on the East Coast, and then became deputy to Dan Go Bronson for the country. And part of that was to administer a competition for young sommeliers. And if anyone who's seen the movie Somm, it's that whole process. And it's partly tasting, service, and what I call wine trivial pursuit. And so I said, if I'm going to administer this sort of program, I might as well kind of learn or appreciate what these younger sommeliers are doing. And so as a result of that, I ended up getting these different trade postnominal certifications to the point where I'm now one step away from being a master sommelier, but my new job has kind of put a kink in that. All right, and so then last year I was dumbfounded and truly humbled when I got elected to the NAE. Shown on the right is Dan Mote. Dan Mote is the president of the NAU, but before that he was the president of the University of Maryland. So it was really special for me to get inducted with Dan there, and I've crossed paths with Dan several times, most recently just a couple. In fact, Dan sent me a nice note on my one-year anniversary. All right, closing to the end part of this talk. Well, it's the UCAR Year. I've only been there a year. Hope I'm there several years. And again, my time here at Goddard really prepared me for UCAR. It's the observations, the modeling, the field studies. All that we do at InCar and UCAR has a lot in common and goes back to sort of my formative years here. So I started formally at UCAR in August 1 of 2016. Prior to that, I was on the board of trustees at UCAR. Initially, I was not interested in the position, but the more and more I thought about it, I had accomplished just about all I could at Maryland. I could have stayed on for another 10 years doing more of the same, but would I really have been true to myself doing that and sort of quasi-retiring in place? ESIC had grown from about $750,000 of income when I started to upwards of $35 to $40 million when I left. So at age of 60 years old, I thought I only had one career move left in me, and I thought I might as well give it a shot. And so the slides, next few slides that remain are similar to my introductory slides yesterday at the Maryland Space Business Roundtable, but really speak to the reason why I left being in DC for 34 years to go to UCAR. So as most of you realize, UCAR is the entity that manages InCar, led by Jim Hurl. We also operate our community programs, led by Bill Quo. And when I get back tomorrow is the 50th anniversary of the Mesa Lab. So we have a big event there. We're rededicating the facility. I will say that as iconic a facility that it is, it really not is conducive anymore to real Earth system science. I mean, these are silos, all right? So that's one. Now, UCAR these days has something like 10 buildings. 3 of them are titled by the NSF. This is one of them. UCAR owns about 7 others. So the vast majority of NCAR personnel are no longer at the Mesa Lab, but they're down on the Foothills campus. But the reason why I came to Boulder was to implement this vision. And that is, the final 4 slides speak to what I believe that we're on a new threshold of prediction of Earth as a coupled system. That better understanding of the Earth system is going to provide tangible and actionable information to a whole range of societal benefit areas. At InCar, we're helping to lead this forecasting frontier and to make progress in this regard and deliver on this potential. We're going to need enhanced observations, both space-based and ground-based, enhanced Earth system models, high-performance computing, data analytics. And to do this is going to require a partnership across governments, academia, and the private sector. And for example, just recently we signed an MOU with IBM, where IBM is going to take our MPAS model and try to accelerate its performance using graphical processors. I mean, this has been a promise for a long time. So the importance, in looking back to the very beginning of InCar, the justification for InCar as the National Center for Atmospheric Research is not what it was 60 years ago in the late 1950s. So at that time, at the time of World War II, the importance of a good weather forecast was painfully obvious. We had no numerical weather prediction models at the time. We had sparse observations of the atmosphere, yet forecasting was critical to the war effort. So what's shown here is the hand-drawn synoptic map that guided the D-Day invasion of Western Europe. After World War II, the US made an unprecedented investment in weather prediction, and that led to the first NWP model being run on the ENIAC platform, shown here in 1950. And so with this new focus on advancing the science of meteorology came the appreciation for the need of a hub to accelerate research on atmospheric sciences. And that was 14 universities came together in the late 1950s to propose the development and the building of a national center. And so here is InCar going up in the early 1960s. As many of you know, the architect was I.M. Pei, and I.M. Pei is about 100, so actually his son is going to be joining us tomorrow for the celebration. So coming out of World War II, our knowledge of the dynamics and physics of the atmosphere, together with the advent of digital computing, accelerated research from groups like InCar, really ushered in today's era of a private sector weather enterprise that is a multi-billion-dollar success story. And though the justification for InCar is not what it was 50, 60 years ago, I truly believe that we're at the critical juncture today where we're entering into this new era of looking at how and our ability to predict how the Earth operates as a coupled system. So in the decades that followed the 1960s, we came to understand as numerical weather predictions were being advancing out days out to a week or 10 days, that in order to improve predictions even further, predictions would benefit from coupling to the oceans and coupling to the land surface. And a good part of that thinking was sort of guided by the perspective we had from space-based platforms. And that those observations and those from the suite of instruments over the past couple of decades really opened up our eyes, as it were, to the interconnected nature of the Earth as a coupled system. And so that brings us to today, and where I truly believe we are at the dawn of a new era of a predictive capability, where over the next several decades, it's not going to happen overnight, but if we have the will and the level of investment we saw coming out of World War II, we can make significant progress. And Earth system prediction, I don't need to preaching to the choir here, but really builds upon the coupling of the physical climate system, how the atmosphere couples to the ocean, the land surface, the cryosphere, how the physical system is coupled with biology and chemistry, how those physical and natural systems are then influencing humanity and influenced in return by humanity. And this is not prediction for prediction's sake. This is exploring what are the limits to predictability of this nonlinear chaotic system. But we're already starting to see some tangible evidence of predictions that have value to agriculture. I spoke yesterday about hydrology, disease vectors, the built environment, energy, and commerce. And so with that, I look forward to joining you on this journey going forward. And again, thanks very much for this invitation to give this talk.
was the secret sauce for getting that money brought over there?
So first of all, I grimaced. I hate this term inside the Beltway, secret sauce. So to answer your question, knowing what the end user wants. All right. So in terms of a cooperative institute, knowing what our NOAA and NASA partners want, and the same goes for you know, the whole basis for climate services. It's not, you can't have a loading dock mentality and tell your government sponsors, this is what you need. No, we need to have a dialogue. And so that's why when, I didn't go through the details, but at Maryland, the Cooperative Institute for the NOAA Cooperative Institute used to be in the Department of Meteorology. And actually, not too long after I started, they moved it into ESIC. And I have a habit of having senior staff meetings, as Andy knows, on Monday morning. And we had a branch of NOAA that sat in our space, and the head of the NOAA branch was at the ESIC senior staff meeting every Monday morning, because I wanted to hear from NOAA what were the problems they needed work on, and I wanted NOAA to have an appreciation for what is the state of the science so that we're not overselling. So bottom line is having that appreciation for what the end user or the customer or the sponsor wants. Yep.
Other comments? So let's thank Tony one more time.
Thank you.